We are going to talk about bannock with Lindsay Middleton and Peter Gilchrist, who are here with us. The talk will be about Florence Marian McNeill, Scottish food history and at-risk tradition. The talk will be about an hour, and first there will be, as usually, talk and then questions. My name is Anna Tominc. I'm going to be a chair of this talk. But first of all, I would like to tell you a little bit about SCAF. That is organizing this talk. SCAF, if you haven't heard about it before, is one of the alliances for research challenges. It means Scottish Alliance for Food, and it's a kind of network of people interested in food and improving food in Scotland. The question for SCAF is, how do we make our food future one that is coherent with keeping people and the planet healthy, but without jeopardizing culture and tradition? And here you can see the bannock comes in at the end of this. Obviously, if you are ever interested in becoming a member of SCAF, you are welcome, unless you aren't there yet. SCAF is interested in various aspects of food chain and generally food, looking at mapping the food system, innovation in food, culture related to food and food security. As you can see here on one side of the slide, it promotes research and networks to do with food in Scotland and food systems in Scotland and food culture in Scotland by supporting projects, organizing webinars, trying to put people together to do various projects and supporting them financially, fostering positive culture, and so on and so forth. You can see here lots of activities always with SCAF. So I would encourage you to become a member if you haven't yet. You can learn more about it down here through this code. But I think that's enough on SCAF. Let's now move to our talk. As I said earlier, we have Lindsay here and Peter. Peter is a food historian or food history writer, and Lindsay is knowledge exchange associate at the University of Glasgow. Both are interested in Scottish history and food and in heritage and tradition. And so I would just like to welcome you maybe to start this talk without further ado. And as we do that, it would be really nice if you introduce yourself also in the chat and maybe tell us about what your interest in food is and why you've joined us today. So thank you again for coming to this. We'll kick off with this talk and then questions in the end, or if you like, also in the chat during this presentation.
So hello everyone, and a very happy World Bannock Day. Today, myself and Lindsay are going to talk a wee bit about the genesis of World Bannock Day, what we're aiming to do with this international holiday, as we're going to start calling it, and our own paths in research here. So to give a very brief introduction, Lindsay, do you want to just introduce yourself first as well, and maybe how you got a little bit into food history?
Sure, thank you, Peter. So hi everyone, I'm Dr Lindsay Middleton, and I'm currently based at the University of Glasgow, where I'm a knowledge exchange associate. I got into food history predominantly through just a love of food and cooking, and then as I was studying my degrees in English literature and history, I ended up doing a PhD on 19th century recipes and food technology. That led me to do some work in the heritage sector, where I sort of found a kind of gap in our understanding of Scottish food history, which led me to do some partnership work, and that's how I met Peter, who the first time I met him turned up at a cafe with a bag full of antique cookbooks. So from then it was love, and we've been working together ever since.
Yes, it's that moment in life where you find someone that speaks your language, and you decide you're going to be collaborators. That was very much my experience. I originally started out as a food writer, and after losing my last grandparent, I inherited family cookery books. And as I began to look into these cookery books, I began to see the same recipes appear again and again. And it piqued an interest for me to think, what was the original shortbread recipe? What was the original scone recipe? I started out very much as an amateur, and over the last 8 years, I have began to style myself as a historian, but still like to use food writer or food history writer as my moniker. So we are kind of here today to talk a wee bit about food heritage, but maybe what I'll just kind of open up with is what exactly is food heritage, or what is the food heritage that myself and Lindsay use as currency. So there's a whole set of tools here, things like economic identity. So the way that the Northeast feels about their buttery versus how the west of Scotland feels about its Glasgow morning roll, how things like recipe books, how books and how recipes travel around Scotland, how people write down recipes and share them with their friends and family, how people value recipes that have been given to them by friends. Oral histories, the things that aren't written down, the folklore, the stories that go along with history, the jobs that people used to work in that don't exist anymore, and their stories and how they're shared. Skills is a big one, and something we're going to talk about today. So whether it's things like the sparrows or roasted mutton that's made in Shetland by one butcher who is going to retire in 5 years' time and no one else is trained in it, we look at the skills and the heritage that could be lost there and what those skills can tell us about how we used to eat. Objects, if there's any other hoarders in the chat that might understand this, the collection of food paraphernalia and antiques and the way that they used to populate our kitchens and how perhaps they could populate our kitchens again. Rituals, so again, the way that people used to cook, the way people used to bake. I talk about the fact that people probably for the last 400 years have been standing over a bowl, rubbing butter into flour. That is a ritual, making shortbread. And if you teach the next generation, they become that next link in that unbroken chain. Rituals can tell us a lot about the way people eat and the way they revered food. Records are a big one. So butter records, the way that food has been politicized, the way food has been overseen, the way that laws have interacted with food. And then food events, things like famine, gluts, the way that food can create a moment in history that people have lived through. They tell us about people's relationship to food. But myself and Lindsay have been working together for some time, and a couple of years ago we put together a report called Beyond the Tartan Tin. The purpose of this report was to look at the challenges that we see in Scotland with our food, and really it focuses on the fact that we have a very unnatural relationship with food in some ways, partially because so much of the way that we present food to the world is food that we cannot afford. It's food that perhaps has a high price tag, food which is scarce, and that actually we don't celebrate the food that really is on our dinner plates. And so we put together a list of recommendations. You can scan that QR code, or we can send out this report after. But one of those recommendations was the creation of a series of events that champion regional Scottish food heritage. And that really is where World Bannock Day came from, as we began to see that bannocks could be the vehicle for celebrating food history. Now, today we're going to look at a few different aspects of bannocks, but really this World Bannock Day started last year. It was sponsored by Hamlin's last year, and we chose the date because it relates to the birthday of a Florence Marian McNeill. If you have never heard of her before, or you've only heard whispers of her in food blogs and cookery books, you will get a bit more of a thorough introduction today. Last year, really, we were kind of presenting online on social media, but we had people from all around the world, from Ontario to Australia, and even as far as Perth in Scotland, making bannocks and sharing them online, some with their own family stories, some sharing bannocks that they had made for the very first time. What we're trying to do is create a dialogue about our food history and get people really engaged in bread which we have been eating for probably thousands of years, and that only very recently, relatively recently, has fallen out of our menus. So there are kind of three aspects to this: the food, the folklore, and Florence. I'm going to talk a wee bit about food, and Lindsay is going to take us home with folklore and Florence. So when we're talking about... I wasn't aware how loud that was. Let me turn that down. So when we're talking about food, what we're really talking about is grains. And in Scotland, there are three ancient grains that you might say: bear, peas, and oats. This is a picture from Living Field. Now, all three of these were incredibly popular, let's say, in our ancestors' diet. Oats is probably the only one that really has remained part of our kind of current food culture. But to dive in, so this here is bear. This is barley. These are bear berries. They're harvested. The only remaining commercial grower is Barony Mill in Bursey in Orkney. You can order bear meal and bear berries from them today. Originally, I discovered bear meal and bear berries when I was cooking a recipe called Burston Brunies. It's a recipe where you take equal amounts of these bear berries and oats, and you're supposed to put them on a three-toed pot over an open fire, and you cook them at incredibly high temperatures until they crack, and then you mill them and create the most delicious smoky gingerbread. But as I began to look into bear, what became apparent is that this was a grain that we have grown for thousands of years, and now there's one business left. In fact, it's a charity now that oversees Barony Mill, and there's a massive. It was my first time coming across an ingredient that was suddenly endangered, or that I had never heard of as a food writer, as a Scottish food writer, as a food history writer. And the second grain, or the second that we flour that is very popular with bannocks was piecemeal. Now, piecemeal has a slightly sadder story because the last commercial grower and miller of piecemeal in Scotland closed in 2022. You cannot buy Scottish piecemeal. But if you pull out any historic map, go into the National Library of Scotland, look through the maps, you will find peas mills, all across Scotland. They were incredibly popular in most towns. They were a kind of as popular as probably whole wheat flour is today in our diet. Piecemeal was that, and you would take your piece, and especially the kind of in the islands, it was especially popular. In the morning, people, normally the women of the house, we have to say, would her job in the morning, one of her first jobs would be to create the piecemeal bannocks or peas bannocks, and you would have a large domed one for each member of the family, and you would rip it apart and have the bottom part for your breakfast, which would be your peas with eggs and bacon, and then you would take your top half, your lunch piece, and have that with your ham or cheese, whatever it was going to be. It was really ingrained in our culture. It was related to our holidays, it was related to our rituals, but slowly but surely it has fallen out and replaced by really white wheat flour, and especially during the kind of the 19th century, as the purity of flour and the trends for bakeries moved far closer to those light doughs that we know now. Piecemeal has slowly faded into obscurity, and now the vital skills for growing peas, for processing and milling peas, has been lost. And the last one, of course, is oats. Now, oats are probably the most popular ingredient in bannocks, especially in the 19th and 20th century. The 18th century writer Samuel Johnson said, "If an epicure could remove by a wish, in quest of sensual gratifications, whatever he had supped, he would breakfast in Scotland." Now, I think, Lindsay, you can back me up here. Samuel Johnson was not necessarily a fan of Scotland. He was not someone who would give compliments willingly, but he says what we all know, which is Scotland does breakfast very well, and that is in no small part due to our mighty oat. Now, we have had oats. The story goes that we've had oats since the Romans. There was a dig a couple of years ago, 2 years ago, in a Pictish site where they found oats and barley that had been parched, that had been used to thicken stews and soups, that had been turned into breads. So oats and oat breads, like bannocks, have been part of our story for thousands of years. We would say that probably in the kind of medieval period, oats really began to take over, and bannocks began to take a vital role in feeding the nation. We do believe that around the world, people have used oats to feed their horses as livestock feed. And actually, if the Romans did bring oats to Scotland, it was to feed their horses. But Scotland's very cold and rainy growing seasons did something very specific to oats. It fortified it with flavour, the same water that creates our whisky and our beautiful landscapes and our lush marshes, where it was perfectly suited, our temperature and our environment was perfectly suited to cultivating tasty, tasty oats. So from the medieval period, we can see that bannocks began to take on a real important part of the peasant diet. And it was actually in the 1349 when the Black Death arrived in Scotland, decimating the population. Cattle farmers were really badly hit. And oats began to replace meat for a period of time. They began to take over the lion's share of sustaining Scotland's population, and definitely is to thank for Scotland being able to recover from its decimated population. When we get to the kind of modern period in the 16th century, we begin to have real analysis of working class diets in Scotland. And so obviously we have root vegetables and eggs and poultry and a small amount of flesh, obviously the name given for meat, but it was porridge that was the largest on daily menus. Kale yards and small kitchen gardens, that were often attached to cottages, provide Scots with the room to grow new potatoes, new crops like potatoes and Swedish turnips, of course. But oats were cited as the #1 expense from croft house to early tenement. We cannot underplay the importance of oats in our history, but they also were definitely tied to the folklore, and Lindsay's going to talk a wee bit about that later. But oats were important in our 4 quarter days that we have in Scotland. So, historically speaking, are you going to talk about this, Lindsay, or can I talk about quarter days? Perfect. Wonderful. So, for those who don't know, Scotland used to be dominated by a calendar of quarter days. So we had Imbolc in February, Beltane in May, Lunasa in August, and Samhain in November. Samhain being the old name for Halloween. Now, when foods become part of our ritual, part of our custom, part of the way that our people break bread and congregate, they take on a vital part in our sense of identity. Part of some of the things that we look at, myself and Lindsay, when we're looking at food history, is the way that our food culture has been stripped away from its people and the impact that has on us as a people and our sense of identity. So when we are coming to celebrate World Bannock Day, we have developed a recipe for a bannock. It is a bare meal bannock, which you can also use an oatmeal to replace that. But there were hundreds of bannock recipes. Recipes like a bride bannock, which was made with buttermilk and served on Imbolc on the 2nd of February. It was made by the women of a community who would go around the houses collecting cakes and bannocks and then throw themselves a women's only party until the boys came and knocked on the doors to be allowed to let in. We also have things like a Rutherglen sour cake, which was a type of bannock. It was a bannock that was made by 8 women that would sit in a circle, and they would all have a chopping board and a rolling pin. And whoever had a toddler that could scoop some of that bannock dough would take it and put it onto the first chopping board, and the first woman would begin to roll out the dough. She would then take it and slap it onto the next chopping block next to her, and that woman would roll it out, and so on and so on. The women would then begin to sing in rhythm with the rhythm of the rolling pin hitting that chopping board. These are individual, specific rituals that our people carried out around oats, next to barley, with piecemeal, creating bannocks. And what we hope to do with World Bannock Day is to slowly begin to reintroduce bannocks to people, to slowly begin to rediscover recipes, to rediscover these rituals, and find authentic ways of people being able to re-engage in their historic culture. Because I don't necessarily want to always see langoustines and beef on a tartan tablecloth when we talk about Scottish food. I don't always like to hear a joke about a deep-fried Mars bar or a deep-fried pizza. There is real history here that could have a seismic impact on the way that we feel about ourselves, about our nation, about our history, and about what makes Scotland identifiable in the world. And bannocks could be the answer. That's me just now on oats, grains, and bannocks. Lindsay, do you want to jump in, or we can jump into questions or
Yeah.
jump into Florence?
I'll jump in because that's quite a nice launching off point for me, and then we can take questions at the end. Thank you, Peter. That was really wonderful. So I'm really going to hone in on Florence Marian McNeill for my part of this talk, because I mean, she's pretty central to the work that Peter and I do. We kind of take her as our inspiration, and her texts are almost the sort of foundation upon which our understandings of Scottish food history really lie on today. So just as a quick introduction, for those of you who don't know, as Peter mentioned, we're celebrating World Bannock Day because 26th of March was Florence's birthday. So happy birthday, Florence. Florence Marian McNeill, she was a suffragist, she was a political figure, she was a public health campaigner, she was an author of various types of writing, and she was a food writer. And she was born in 1885 and died in 1973. And this is a picture of her when she's quite young, looking very beautiful, but there are wonderful pictures of her throughout her life. She was born in Orkney, and I think that's why Peter and I both gravitate towards Barney Mill and Bear Bannocks on this day, because it feels particularly appropriate to be cooking something from her home part of Scotland. But we think that, just like Bannocks, Florence is vastly underrated in terms of our understanding of Scottish food history. She wrote prolifically across the Scotsman, the Glasgow Herald, magazines like Scottish Field. She wrote novels, she wrote just travel guides to Scotland, and she also wrote food writing, including the Book of Breakfasts, recommended recipes. She wrote the Scots Cellar, which is wonderful around Scottish drinks. So the book I'm going to be mainly talking about today is my favourite and most used of Florence's books. It's The Scots Kitchen, its traditions and lore with old-time recipes. It was published in 1929, and I think the book forms a foundation of our current understanding of Scottish food history. She uses a lot of historical texts that came before her, predominantly Christian Isabel Johnson's The Cook and Housewife's Manual, published in the early 19th century. But what she does is she writes recipes, she gathers recipes from around Scotland, historical recipes, and she surrounds them with the kind of history and folklore that underpin them. So it's a really useful, not just as a cookbook, but also as a reference text. She uses song, she uses literature and poetry, and everything comes together in a sort of collection that exemplifies how Scottish food heritage is not just the history of what we ate, but as Peter was saying, it's the history of people and culture and place. So there are two quotes from the introduction of the Scots Kitchen that I'm going to open with. Peter, if you could move to the next slide, please. The first reads, "In the preliminary sketch, I've tried to show how from the earliest times, through the period of romantic semi-savagery in the Highlands, the period of cosmopolitan elegance, Edinburgh's golden age, and in the days of the Old Alliance, the sober Highland Bros period that succeeded the Reformation, and on to modern times, the pageant of Scottish history is shadowed in the kitchen." Now, I love this quote because I think it really gets the heart of what McNeill in her time and what Peter and I and others, if I can speak for us both, feel about food. It's a medium through which we can understand a myriad of things about history. As Peter has shown us through talking about grains and bannocks, Scottish foods were shaped by weather, by geography, tradition, and also story. And that's what McNeill shows us in her text. She shows us that whole pageant of Scottish history, or histories shadowed in the kitchen. The second quote I like as an opening point to McNeill's book is on the next slide, please, Peter. She writes, "Yes, the object of this book is not to provide a complete compendium of Scottish cookery, ancient or modern, for many of the dishes prepared in the Scots kitchen are common to the British Isles, some indeed to Europe." And I quite like that as a point because she's saying, you know, we as an island, we as a continent often share foods. But what she wants to do is to preserve the recipes of our old national dishes, many of which in this age of standardization are in danger of falling into an undeserved oblivion. Now, again, it's this final point that McNeill's speaking to the driving force behind her writing, which is the very real risk that without significant effort, for preservation, much of Scottish food heritage is at risk of being forgotten. Now, I think, bearing in mind this was published in 1929, today we are potentially even more of what McNeill describes as that age of standardization. So many of us, when we're cooking, myself included, just turn to Google or to the internet or social media for food inspiration or recipes, and we might not read or record our own recipes. We might not have things passed down to us through families in the way that we used to. That said, as we hope World Bannock Day is a good example of, sharing through social media offers a really exciting new way to preserve Scottish food history and our national dishes that McNeill is describing. So perhaps I think today and through World Bannock Day, we are endeavouring to continue Florence's efforts in our own way. I think a key reason that Scottish food heritage and our traditions and recipes are in danger of fading towards this undeserved oblivion is that the sort of nature of how we engage with and buy food today, the rise of supermarkets and preservative technologies, global food chains, mean we're used to buying and eating whatever we want all year round, rather than relying on our kale yards, our kitchen gardens that Peter was describing. That's not to say that Scottish food is or ever really was confined to what could be grown or reared in Scotland. Very early manuscript cookbooks, particularly for the wealthy, demonstrate that from the 16th century onwards, Scotland's position within the British Empire meant that food and drink and materials from all over the world were coming to Scottish shores. So we see recipes with things like wines and spices, even early recipes from the 18th century describing things like pottage with chervil the Dutch way or lobsters the Italian way. So we have these sort of international influences very early on, but they did tend to be in the homes of the wealthy. And the Scottish foods that we tend to think of as traditional, like the bannock, are those of the working classes. So it typically was plain or fare that could be locally sourced, and it therefore became inextricable from the geography and the associations of the country that it comes from. Those delicious oats with Scottish water, or your kale that you could grow because, you know, lighter vegetables like asparagus didn't take hold. My dad in Aberdeenshire is still struggling with this, even though he has a fancy greenhouse now. Peter, if you could move to the next quote, please. But what McNeill says is, she says, the art of a country always has its roots in the soil, and the study of comparative cookery shows that however plentiful and varied the imported foodstuffs, it is the natural conditions and products that determine the general character of the national cuisine. So what I really like here is how closely McNeill ties national understandings of food to land. And I think one thing that increasingly, as we experience disruptions to our food chains or issues like the climate crisis, one potential solution is to turn to foods that we can more easily produce and grow and rear at home. So I think there's a really important message that comes through all of this about paying more attention to what you can have from the land around you. But what's striking throughout McNeill's book, and she starts with 6 essays before you get to the recipes that sort of unpack various things about Scottish food history and our diet, is the amount that she draws upon different historical sources and how she links understandings of Scottish food to national character. So she has so many references throughout her book. Some pages are kind of almost more written in others' hands than her own. She has lengthy footnotes throughout. She uses a range of historical and literary sources, including Scottish and Gaelic poems, songs, local accounts. She quotes people like Robert Burns and Christian Isabel Johnson, who I mentioned earlier, as well as some big and non-Scottish authors who had travelled around Scotland and written about the food. So we have Dorothy Wordsworth, William Coleridge, Alan Ramsay, Robert Ferguson and Walter Scott, these sort of big names that readers would have been familiar with. And what she's really doing is making a catalogue of information from famous and anonymous authors who don't take food as their primary topic necessarily, but who touch upon it regardless of what they're writing about, because food is so fundamental to all conditions of life. She's therefore not just trying to convince the reader of the merits of Scottish food on her own as someone who was clearly very passionate about it, but she's using these big names to demonstrate how how Scottish food should be viewed in certain lights. And this was where I was going to read the Dr. Johnson quote about breakfast, but Peter's already done that for me. So he enjoyed our breakfast, and I would like to think maybe had a bannock as part of that. But we have all sorts of really interesting sources. There's sort of too many to have gone through in quotes on the slides. But what I find really striking is that while she has these big name authors, she already has she also has very local authors. She has working class poets, and she can, at some point, she contains entire inventories of working class Scottish kitchens in history. And then she brings in the sort of various voices and languages that form Scotland. So she has translated Gaelic churning and quern grinding and walking songs that I imagine would have accompanied those bannock making processes that Peter was talking about. She includes the voices of working class Scots through their literary representatives and through these sort of folkloric texts and poems and songs that she's including as well. And this blend of historical fact and fiction and song and poetry creates a sort of compendium of cultural outputs, and it really illuminates how rich the history of Scottish food is. I really like how she creates this kind of patchwork text. It's almost an ethnography of Scottish food through the people, and that it speaks to food's importance across different cultural spheres. We have the political, the geographical, literary, local, national, so on and so on. And McNeill's multivocal text is really positioning Scottish food as foundational to its cultural identity. You know, Scottish nationalism is something that cannot be, and by that I don't mean, you know, just a national pride, but Scottish cultural identity cannot be extricated from its food. What I think is really interesting about McNeill's writing is that she depicts the national character of Scottish food as something that's really rooted in pride and generosity and sharing, and it's very much tied, again, as bannocks were, to generosity, to working classes, to making the most with what you have. She says at one point, "The nation, after all, dwells in the cottage, and it is in the cottage that one finds all that is most truly characteristic of the nation." So she's talking about the fact that you could look at the tables of the rich, you could look at the tables of the famous, but actually where you find the heart of Scottish food, Scottish cookery, and Scottish identity is in the cottage, in the places where working class, real people were living their lives. If you could move to the next quote, please, Peter, I think. Yes, so what I really like here is, this is where, when she's describing these sort of plain foods, this is where McNeill's authorial voice really shines out. She doesn't really ever go into any great detail about the big banquets that might have been going on, but she describes what she calls typical meals with a kind of poetic detail. She says, "In the early Scots kitchen, the fare consisted of game or fish, or boiled or seethed in primitive fashion over the peat embers, barley bannocks and oatcakes baked on the ancient gredeal or gridiron griddle, cheese and butter, wild fruit, wild herbs, and the honey of the wild bee." Now, I'm definitely romanticizing my reading of this excerpt because I just think it's very beautiful, but to me this almost reads like a poem, and she's emphasizing the proximity of historical Scottish food to the land that it came from foraged ingredients to the peat that would have come to the land and would have not only cooked your food but warmed your home. She mentions bannocks, and in the recipes that follow these opening essays, McNeill regularly refers to bannocks as part of daily life, but she also provides us with numerous bannock recipes. And I think on the next slide, Peter, I've got some pictures of. So you can see here, she's got her bear or barley bannocks, and she's starting, this is a nice example, actually, you can see in the small writing here, she has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 excerpts from different kinds of text before she gets to her recipe. So we have burns, we have an old song, things that aren't attributed to authors, but she's showing how this food is so rooted in folklore, in tradition, in song and poetry and ritual. So what McNeill is showing is how a simplistic, varied diet is infused with tradition, and she's mentions that through the ancient griddle. She's evoking a very long history of practice over cooking bannocks, cooking oatcakes over the fire. She writes, over and over again in our proverbs and poetry, the virtue of frugality is lauded. So again, she is mentioning how the real heart of Scottish food is the ability to do a lot with a little and make delicious things that you're not only enjoying to eat, but you're actually putting into your songs, your poetry, your ritual as well. And it's this tenacity and ingenuity that really shines through McNeill's writing that gives Scottish food its identity and ties it into national identity. And we can see that in our better known dishes like haggis, which was really made of the cheap offal and blood of an animal and then padded out with oatmeal so nothing was wasted. So there was a real undercurrent of pride in McNeill's writing. She didn't see poverty or simple food as anything to be ashamed of, but she praises Scottish people for their ability to create delicious food from what they have, and then create culture and meaning around it through writing, through poetry, through song, through sharing what they had. It was these tough conditions that created a generosity which Scots are famed for. And I think, Peter, if you could move to the next slide, she says, the free and open hospitality. Oh, in fact, go back to, so this was just showing her, and it's very dense, I don't think you can read this text, but this was showing her footnotes, and then how she's talking about all these different varieties of oatcakes throughout her text in various ways. And if you go to the next slide, please, Peter. She writes, the free and open hospitality which characterise a primitive condition of society survived much later in Scotland, particularly in the Highlands, than in those more civilised countries of Europe. And she then goes on to talk about how hospitality is a real characteristic of Scottish people and how they would share their food with anyone who knocked on their door. One thing I find really interesting is apparently hotel and sort of inn culture took off far later in Scotland than it did in England and other parts of the UK, because if you knocked on someone's door and asked for a meal and to stay the night because you were traipsing through the Highlands, they would welcome you with open arms and a dram. And she says, yes, as for the common people, they were chiefly characterised by good manners, pride, inquisitiveness, and a genius for hospitality. So what she's doing is characterising Scottish food as a cuisine marked by a history of survival and generosity. Food was to be shared, no one was to go hungry, and Peter and I have spoken about how this is tied into other rituals like sharing feasts at times like Christmas or Hogmanay, and everyone was also always welcome at the hearth. So by the time you as a reader reach the recipes in the Scots Kitchen, if you've read her introductory essays, you're warmed by this knowledge that if you're going to prepare one of McNeill's dishes, you're participating in culinary practice that was meant to be shared and passed on between generations. So she's doing this wonderful kind of textual exemplifying of how we can share knowledge about food as a way of preserving it. So by framing food through storytelling and these famous authors, literature, historical traditions, what McNeill is doing, using her own voice and the voice of those who she's quoting, she's illuminating the manifold meaning that food carries through all parts of life. And she's also kind of creating a canon of meaning around Scottish food writing. She's collecting and protecting Scottish food history for future generations to come and drawing upon numerous voices to back up her cause. And I think this is what this shows us, is how well it can be done if we continue these efforts to pick up recipes, to share things, to post a video online, to talk to your mum, talk to your granny, talk to whoever's the food provider in your house about what they ate when they were little, and doing our own bit to record this. This is how Scottish food history is preserved. I think another thing that McNeill's book shows us is that where things like bannocks are still at risk of fading into oblivion or being undervalued or at risk of being lost. So I think it really falls to people, researchers or storytellers or food enthusiasts, to kind of pick up this mission and make sure that Scottish food history, and by extension our heritage, our tradition, our literature and our culture, don't slip into obscurity. So that's really the kind of driving force behind a lot of what Peter and I do, and why we want people around the world to learn to bake a bannock, to relearn to bake a bannock, to share it with their friends, share it with their family, and really, show that it doesn't need to be a big glamorous food, it doesn't need to be anything shiny or flashy, but actually through sharing these traditions we can make sure they're preserved for generations to come. And I think that's me, Peter, if you had that.
Yes, thank you very much, Lindsay. I have, myself and Lindsay have a podcast called the Scottish Food History Podcast, and we did 2 episodes on the life of Florence Marian McNeill. I will say that as part of this research, I was in touch with the Orkney Library, who found a tape of Florence Marian McNeill speaking to an interviewer. I thought this might be a lovely way for us to close out this talk, is to listening to the words of Florence herself and how she began her life as a food writer.
Miss F. Marian McNeill talks about her Orkney childhood.
We went to the parish school, and I used to learn from the children there all sorts of stories. I used to hear about witches and fairies and mermaids and whatnot, and I laughed it all up. I used to be terrified of any strange old woman I met in case she was a witch.
The landscape itself, did that make a great impression on you as a child?
Oh, indeed it did. I think that great arch of sky was most impressive. And then the atmosphere, especially I remember those wonderful sunsets. I used to think I was looking at the gates of heaven when the western sky was all crimson and gold.
And then the people, how did the man's children see them?
Oh, well, they meant a great deal to us. We used to go in and out among the cottages. We were always made welcome. There's so much hospitality. And we used to love the island fare, the bear bannocks and the Orkney cheese, and especially a cake called bruni that I was very partial to, a kind of oatmeal gingerbread.
How did you get introduced to that?
Well, we used to take pieces to school, and I used to have perhaps carvy biscuits or something that the other children thought rather exotic. And I remember one little girl used to bring along a kind of oatmeal gingerbread which she called bruni. And we used to barter, exchange our pieces at times. And I was so intrigued with this, I said to her one day, "What's in it?" I was about perhaps 5 or 6 at the time, so I collected my very first recipe.
Oh, yes. And that was a genesis of the Scots kitchen, perhaps?
It was. It was in a sense. It was my very first recipe.
Well,
So, thank you very much for listening to us today. If you do want to find out more about Florence Marian McNeill, I would encourage you to go and listen to, not just self-promotion here, but we do jump into the life of Florence Marian McNeill, a fascinating woman. We have not scratched the surface by talking just about her food work. She has had enormous influence in Scotland, and I think it's sad that we don't have a big statue of her somewhere prominent. But yes, this is our talk today on World Bannock Day.
Yes. Thank you, everyone.